Welcome back to another episode of Opalwave MTG. I'm your host Jacob, and today we're going to be talking about a recent tournament that I played in just yesterday on the CompetitiveEDH Discord server. It was a small tournament, about probably 24 or so people. I decided to bring this really spicy deck, Dargo the Shipbreaker and Sidar Kondo of Jamura. So I've been grinding competitive EDH tournaments for about a year now, and I primarily play my favorite deck, which is Minced Garlic. You can find that on the DB, and if you're interested in seeing a video deck tech on that, let me know in the comments below. Both of these decks feature Academy Rector as a very efficient win con, and since ever since seeing the I think his name is Space Tank McGee making top 16 at the Cash Cards Unlimited tournament about a month ago, I've been really interested in this deck, and I've been making some tweaks, and basically what I've based on my experience playing the deck and grinding the deck for the past 3 weeks before I decided to take it into this tournament. So essentially, Dargo is a 7-mana giant pirate. You can sacrifice any number of artifacts and creatures as an additional cost to cast Dargo, and if you do, he costs 2 less to cast for each one of those things that you sacrificed. In addition, Dargo also costs 2 less to cast for each creature or artifact you've sacrificed before it this turn. So a very efficient sack outlet if it were in the command zone. And then we've got Sidar. Sidar has flanking, makes blocking really hard, and creatures your opponents control without flying or reach can't block creatures with power 2 or less. And to be honest, Sidar is pretty much here for colors, just to add the green and the white. There can be some really interesting situations with cards like Professional Facebreaker, as well as Ragavan, where you basically make these 2 cards unblockable, and you can get some nice value out of that. But outside of that, Sidar is just here for the colors. So the primary function of this deck, like I said before, is to get an Academy Rector into play, and then cast Dargo, sacrificing Academy Rector. And when we do that, we have an Academy Rector trigger on the stack, and that is going to find Greater Good. And once we get Greater Good, Dargo will resolve, and now we can sacrifice Dargo to Greater Good to draw 7 cards and discard 3. So from here, we have a decent amount of fast mana, as well as a few rituals, in addition to cards like Burgi, and a really cool inclusion from Dominaria, Relic of Legends, that essentially make casting Dargo free. So once we get one of these pieces out, in addition to the Greater Good, we can essentially just draw out our entire deck for free, pretty much. So once we start getting drawing our deck, we need to start asking ourselves, how are we winning, right? So essentially, our main win conditions are going to be either Burgi and the Relic of Legends, in addition to a Goblin Bombardment. So from here, we can sacrifice Dargo for 1 red, or cast Dargo for 1 red. We can either tap Dargo to make another red, or we've produced a red off of our Burgi. And from there, we can sacrifice Dargo with Goblin Bombardment to deal 1 damage to any target. So from here, we can deal infinite damage to the table. Our other win condition is going to be with Defiler of Instinct. And Defiler is actually super sweet. Another really great card for this deck that came out from Dominaria, where we can essentially pay 2 life instead of the red in red permanent spells we cost. So essentially, when Dargo costs only 1 red, we can pay 2 life instead of the red. And from there, it makes Greater Gooding a lot easier, because we can essentially just pay 2 life to draw 7 cards, and from that point we can find other pieces of fast mana or our Burgi or something like that. But another cool thing about this is that it says whenever you cast a red permanent spell, Defiler of Instinct deals 1 damage to any target. So in addition to it being an enabler, it is also going to be one of our win conditions. So once we get a Defiler out, as well as a Thermopod, we can start sacrificing Dargo to make a red, and then we can recast our Dargo, and from there, Defiler of Instinct will start dealing infinite damage to the table. So these are going to be our 2 main win conditions. The rest of the deck is a lot of, we've got a lot of mana dorks here, in addition to tutors, so we can find that Academy Rector out, get it out ASAP, and a lot of other enablers, stuff like Treasonous Ogre can kind of fit the same role as Defiler in terms of enabling our Dargo line, since we can pay 3 life to add a red to our mana pool. Then we've also got a lot of protection, so cards like Ranger Captain, Grand Abolisher, Flame Scroll, Celebrant, which on the opposite side, let's see, how do you, yeah, there we go, flip. So Revel in Silence. This deck can fold to a lot of different things. And since it is a manual a manual storm deck, we really want to make sure that we have a silence effect out, or our opponents are shields down when we go for our combo, especially if our opponents have like a Rhystic Study or a Mystic Remora out. So a lot of silence effects. We've got Ragavan and the Professional Facebreaker to kind of put us into like a mid-range kind of a mode. Not every game we're going to be able to go off on turn 2 or 3, which, would be fantastic if we could. But, sometimes there's a turn 1 Draneth or a turn 1 or turn 2 Rule of Light type effect, and those stacked pieces hit this deck really, really hard. So having a few pieces that can let us kind of go into that mid-range and kind of start accruing value, maybe find some removal for the key pieces that we need to get rid of before we combo off, is pretty important. The next really interesting include here I have is Endurance, Fury, and Solitude. And my thought process behind this is, if we need to go for our greater good lines when we don't have a ton of mana up, so like let's say we've got like 6 mana total, we can cast our Academy Rector, and then we can pay 1 red and sacrifice Academy Rectors in addition to 2 other things. We can cast our Dargo, find greater good, and from there we're going to see the top 14 cards of our library. And while there's a really good chance that we're going to find more fast mana, maybe some rituals in those top 14 cards, it's not guaranteed. So in addition to these cards being really powerful removal effects, they can also be a free rummage, since we can evoke them by exiling another card from our hand, and then in response to the evoke trigger where we sacrifice one of these creatures, we can sacrifice it to greater good, and we can then see an additional 3 cards. So from there, it just makes viewing the greater good lines a little bit more not guaranteed, but it lets us see a few extra cards when we are performing the manual storm, and we don't have a ton of mana available when we start the combo. You can't always start the combo with like a Burgi in play or the Defiler, and so in those situations it could be really good just to see an extra 3 cards. It could be the difference between you finding that LED or Jeweled Lotus, or you just completely fizzling out on your combo. So moving on to our sorceries, I've got 2 really interesting includes here with Blasphemous Act and Winds of Abandon, and the more I play on these tournaments, the more I see that players are not ready for Winota or any of the other stacks decks. And since this deck does tend to kind of fold, it has a really hard time actually winning through cards like a Draneth Magistrate and a Rule of Law, Archon of Emeria type effects. It can be really easy for us to fall behind and then not have an answer for like multiple stacks pieces on the board. And so cards like Blasphemous Act and Winds of Abandon are going to be perfect when dealing with decks like Winota, your Jetmirs, or even if there's just a bunch of stacks pieces on the board in general, like maybe there's a couple opposition agents or something like that. And instead of Blasphemous Act, you could do something like a Delayed Blast Fireball. I really just wanted to try out Blasphemous Act in this tournament. I think most of the time we'll be able to cast this for like 1 or 2 mana, maybe 3 sometimes. So yeah, I definitely just wanted to try it, and I unfortunately did not draw it at all throughout the tournament. But as you'll see in the game, the top 4 game, I actually do draw Winds of Abandon, and it comes in pretty clutch, during that game. So we'll get to that. The rest of this is just rituals and tutoring. Sylvan Tutor is actually really great for the deck, since we can use it while we're doing our greater good lines, to put a creature on top of our library, maybe a Burgi or the Defiler or a Treasonous Ogre. You'll also notice that I am not on wheels, and while there is a decent amount of rituals and fast mana in the deck, I am not. There's been a lot of talk lately about wheels in general, and a lot of times when people wheel before me, I just win. or the person after them just wins. Wheel pass is a extremely risky move unless you can actually win the game after doing that wheel, and even then it's not guaranteed that you're going to win off that wheel unless you have something like a Narset or a Notion Thief, or something in that regard where you can gain a significant advantage after casting that wheel. And like the best case scenario for wheels most of the time is like turn 1 before anyone else has a chance to like play out their fast mana and stuff, where you can break parity on that wheel. So that's why you don't see wheels in my version of the deck. Other versions are using wheels. Me personally, I'm not a big fan of running wheels in my decks unless I have a really good reason or a great way to take advantage and break parity on giving my opponent's card advantage. Moving on to the instance, just a few removal spells, stuff like a Braid, Swords of Plowshares. We've got some protection, stuff like Veil of Summer, Silence, again, really important. Slots became really, really tight, and I decided to just stick with Elemental Blast, since the other blast has the if clause, so it can be swatted and stuff like that. And then we've got Final Fortune, which can help us sneak out some wins, which actually did help me sneak out a win in the 4th round of Swiss. That essentially let me cast that allowed me to cast a Recruiter of the Guard to find an Academy Rector, and then from there I could Final Fortune, take another turn, and proceed to do my Greater Good lines. So Final Fortune can be really great in these turbo style decks. A little bit risky, especially if you don't have like a Grand Abolisher or Silence type effect to make sure opponents can't interact with you, but still a really great extra turn spell. Moving on to our artifacts, we've got the Defense Grid, which you don't cast this card unless you're going to win. Much like the 3 fairy, that stops your opponents from interacting. You casting this and passing the turn is very, very scary. You definitely want to make sure that you're casting this spell and then you are immediately trying to win the game. And then the rest is just a bunch of fast mana. We do have Altar of Dementia, which can serve as another win con in the deck. If we get like Bergie or something, we can mill out our opponents. Again, that can be a little iffy too, because there's still cards like Noxious Revival or Endurance where they can just shuffle their deck back in. But it's still a decent enough win con and a sacrifice outlet in and of itself. So pretty decent. And then yeah, a bunch of fast mana. Again, that Relic of Legends is going to be awesome since we can tap untapped legendary creatures to add 1 mana of any color. So eventually, once we start making the red with Dargo, if we need to make green, we can make green instead. Whatever colors we really need to, especially if we want to go off and do a Metamorphosis. This card is super sweet since we pay 1 green, we sacrifice Dargo, and then we're going to make 8 red. And once you get Metamorphosis, once you get 8 red with the Greater Good line, you just win. The odds that you fail are so low, because you're going to be drawing 56 cards. And finally, moving on to our enchantments, we've got the star of the show, which is Greater Good, very powerful card. Sylvan Library to let us get a really great head start. Survival of the Fittest, just another fantastic tutor. It can find our silence type effects. You can find Rector. You can find other combo pieces if you just want to try to assemble a combo without really doing the Greater Good lines. Goblin Bombardment as another win con, and that Underworld Breach, because eventually, another way we can kind of guarantee our lines with Underworld Breach is, once we get either a Lion's Eye Diamond or a Jeweled Lotus, we can sack the Jeweled Lotus or the Lion's Eye to make 3 red. We'll cast Dargo, and because we're going to be discarding cards with Greater Good, you guarantee that you can escape 3 cards with the Underworld Breach, because once you cast Dargo 3 times, you're going to be milling or discarding at least 9 cards, which is plenty of fuel to either recast the LED or the Jeweled Lotus. So once you get Underworld Breach with Greater Good and one of your rituals, you're pretty much guaranteed to see the rest of your library too. And in our lands, just a lot of really fantastic lands. Again, not again, but I'm a big fan of at least having 1 basic in your deck, whether it's a Path to Exile or an Assassin's Trophy, or there's like an Archon and you need to get that extra untapped land into play. I think having at least 1 basic is really good, and so I generally try to keep at least 1 basic in my deck. So with that, let's go ahead and check out the final 4 pod that I was in. Kind of go through a breakdown of my thought process and just how I thought the game went. So before we go ahead and start the game, I want to talk about my opening hand and my thought process on my mulligans and what I'm looking for. So I was actually really fortunate with my opening hand. It was what I thought, pretty good for the pod. So it was 2 lands, a Dockside Extortionist, Court of Calling, Survival of the Fittest, Treasonous Ogre, and a Winds of Abandon. So in this pod specifically, I am definitely looking for an answer for the Winota deck. Something that a lot of players aren't doing right now is they aren't prepping or having some kind of an answer for Winota in their decks. People are like taking out Toxic Deluges, and or like in blue, your only answer is really just like an overloaded Cyclonic Rift, and by the time you're like casting that Cyc Rift with like Glow Riders and Thalia, it's probably too late by the time you can actually cast said Cyc Rift. So yeah, I'm looking for some kind of an answer for the Winota deck. If I don't, I am put into an extremely parasitic position where I'm assuming that either Ring or Twang can deal with the Winota, and as we'll see in the game, it kind of turns out that they weren't super prepared for the Winota deck. So with that hand, the Winds of Abandon allows me to overload it, and I can just completely take care of Quanos' board. But the other thing is that if Twang and Ring don't have very good answers for Winota, Winota can start applying pressure to Twang and Ring while I kind of accrue my resources, and then once they've killed those blue players that can interact with me a little bit more effectively, I can wipe Quanos' board and then try to do my own win attempt, especially since I have very powerful tutors, as well as very explosive options with the Treasonous Ogre and the Dockside Extortionist. So yeah, my hand turned out to be really great for the pod, and so I decided to keep it. So we'll go ahead and start now. So we've got the blue farm player going first, Twang, who starts off with Otawara into Simian Spirit Guide, Rite of Flame, casting a turn 1 Rhystic Study. And Dargo, this Dargo deck has a kind of hard time playing through Rhystic Study unless you get some kind of Grand Abolisher or Silence type effect out. It is nice that the Otawara is gone, which means that if I do land a Silence type effect, I now have to deal with 1 less Otawara from Twang here. So we've got a Rogue Rack and a Mother of Runes coming out from Quanos. The Winota deck can't really just not play spells, so they kind of need to just start racing the Rhystic Study and apply pressure to Twang before they can find an answer for the Winota deck. So I 100% agree with Quanos just playing out their hand and getting things on the board as fast as possible. I actually end up drawing into a Ragavan, so in the same vein, I can't really not play out spells as well. So I go ahead and cast my Ragavan, and in addition to wanting to not fall behind in terms of resources, I also want Twang to draw a few more cards so they can actually find interaction for the Winota. Because if they do, I can now hold on to my Winds of Abandon for even longer and in a way kind of start accruing a little bit more card advantage, because now I don't need to waste my Winds of Abandon super early if Twang can find an answer for the Winota here. Ring also cannot afford to not advance their board state as well, so they feed the Rhystic 2 more times. This is also, pretty scary since we did just feed the blue farm a bunch of cards and now they're at 10. They did allude to not having a very good hand, and it was really banking on this Rhystic Study, and that's why I felt a little bit more comfortable actually feeding all these cards into their hand. So then we've got a Command Tower coming out from Twang, followed by a Fell Warstone, and I believe they cast a Chrome Mox here, and they do something kind of odd. I guess the only blue spell in their hand at this point that was worth pitching was a Mental Misstep, but as we're about to find out, the Mental Misstep actually would have been absolutely huge in slowing down the Winota player here. So now we've got 2 open mana on Twang. Winota casts a Mana Vault. Doesn't pay for the Rhystic. Again, we can't really afford to not cast our spells, not advance our game plan, so we kind of have to feed the Rhystic here in order to start applying pressure as soon as possible. Now, I believe Quanos does pay for the Ristic Study here, though. While you do need to advance your board state, it's still a good idea to pay for the Ristic when you have the opportunity to do so. So we'll play it on Quanos, counting up their mana, making sure they get just enough. You're either going to pay for the Ristic on this one or pay for the Ristic on the next spellcast, because they have 3 treasures plus the colorless floating from the mana vault, so they now have the ability to cast their commander. We now have a Winota on the stack, not paying for the Ristic. It's going to give Twang one more card. Unfortunately, no Force of Will here. Would have been really great to slow down the Winota player. Again, you know, if there was a mental misstep for that mana vault, that would have been absolutely huge. So now we get to move to combat. Gargat's going to come at me, and then we're actually going to see something really interesting here. Ranger Captain is going to get hit, which actually makes it a little bit more difficult for me to actually win through this. Not only is it really hard for me to win through a Ristic Study, you know, winning through a cracked Ranger Captain is also kind of difficult because I need a decent amount of non-creature rituals in order to actually win with the Greater Good combo. So the Ranger Captain actually comes in tapped and attacking me, and then we were like, you know, why aren't you attacking the player that's been drawing a bunch of cards and is on the Adnaz plan? And they end up changing their mind. And I actually, you know, later on in this match, I'm actually gonna kind of bring up a very interesting point about, you know, once a decision is made, potentially making players stick to that decision. So the changes, so we changed the attack target from myself to the Ranger Captain, which I think is correct. And there's also another thing here. I'm kind of in this position where I just want to just chill and draw cards and not really do too much, while the Winota player beats down Twang. And now I feel a little bit more comfortable feeding Twang cards because of the Ranger Captain. So essentially at this point, if Twang tries to just go for a win, the Ranger Captain can be cracked and stop Twang from winning the game. If this now forces Twang to actually find some kind of removal for the Ranger Captain. So now we move on to my turn, and I'm kind of thinking, because I have this Dockside in my hand, I'm thinking if I want to just cast my Dockside and try to do some interesting shenanigans there. Of course, we're going to move to combat first, put more pressure on Twang. Since I am drawing Twang cards, I want to reduce their life total since they are the Adnaz player. We get a land off of the Ragavan trigger. A little unfortunate, but I do make a treasure, which is really nice. I'm going to play a land, and from there, I'm going to cast I end up casting Survival. I didn't want to paint too much of a target on my head. I know that Quanos is already, like, wanting to attack me, considering how hastily they just swung their stuff at me before really taking a second to think about who they should be attacking. And I knew that if I cast Dockside here, I'm going to paint a massive target on my back, making 5 treasures, going up to 6 mana, potentially doing something kind of crazy on my next turn. So I didn't want to, you know, paint too much of a red flag here. So I cast the Survival here. I don't pay for the Ristic because I want to keep my treasure. And we're going to give Twang that card, and then I just pass the turn. So then we move on to Ring's turn. We've got a Tundra coming out of Ring. We're going to pay 2, and we're just going to throw down Thrasios. You know, their hand actually wasn't, like, it was actually a pretty decent hand. Turn 1, Bloom Tender. Turn 2, Thrasios. You can start tapping and accruing value. Unfortunately, the Winota hand was just really, really strong and had a very explosive start, which makes their hand a little awkward. We're going to move to Twang's turn. We're going to draw a card. Play our Forbidden Orchard, or Exotic Orchard, can never remember. And Twang actually has their own Ranger Captain, which is a little scary, but at the same time, you know, Quanos still has their Ranger Captain, so if, like, Twang tries to, like, you know, sack Ranger Captain to make their, when they're trying to win, Quanos can just crack his in response and make Twang's win attempt very hard. So we grab an Esper Sentinel, cast our Esper Sentinel. We just want to draw more cards with the Esper Sentinel, which I'm totally fine with. We move to Twang's Instep. We're going to discard some cards. Let's see. Discarding a Vertic Catacombs and a Hollowed Fountain. Move to our main. Loses a life off of the Mana Vault since he cannot pay for it. So Winota moves to combat, and with no responses to combat, move to the beginning of the combat phase, and we channel a Sokensen. Which is actually super huge here. They did have double legendaries with the Rograk and the Winota, so Sokensen only costs 2 mana, which is actually kind of crazy because, it's 2 additional Winota triggers and actually ups the clock quite significantly here. Quanos swings all 5 at me, which makes a lot of sense since I am the only player without blockers, at least for the little dudes. Recruiter of the Guard, ETB, finds the Selfless Dog. I don't know if that's the actual name of it, but this is the dog that you sacrifice to make something indestructible. Our second of 5 Winota triggers is going to find an Angrath's Marauders, which will enter the battlefield, tapped and attacking Twain as well, which is actually going to it's the explosive nature of Winota. Our third find is going to be a Blood Moon, or Magus of the Moon, rather. Fourth is going to be a Thalia's Lancers, which is going to tutor up for a Hope of Girper. And our fifth Winota trigger is going to find a Combat Celebrant. And this actually puts a lot of pressure on me to actually wipe the board. The odds of us not, losing on our next turn, or at least the next combat step of Quanos, is going to be very minuscule, since they will get double combat steps with the Combat Celebrant. Puts me in a really awkward situation where I am now forced to, wipe the board here or attempt to combo on my turn. So I end up taking 6 from the 3 1-power creatures that were swung at me, doubled with the Angrath's Marauders. The Esper Sentinel blocks the Combat Celebrant to negate 4 of the damage. Unfortunately, the Combat Celebrant does gain Indestructible for the rest of the turn. We're going to lose the Esper Sentinel here from Twang. And then he's going to end up taking a whopping 8, 12, 18, 20 damage here. So we move to my turn. And this is a big turn for me. I can either attempt to win here with the explosive nature of my hand, as I said before, with the Dockside and the Treasonous Ogre. And as I'm trying to figure out what I'm doing here, Ring actually informs me that they have multiple removal spells and are able to interact with me. So if I attempt to win, it will be for naught. And there's a big thing about telling your opponent that, because I'm not going to try to win through a heuristic study in addition to the extra removal that I already know Ring has. And if I try to go for a win here, Ring wastes their removal and their interaction on me, and then they won't have it for Twang. So if I try to combo here, I'm basically guaranteeing Twang the game, more or less. I'm casting my Dockside, and after a little bit more thinking, I finally decide that my best course of action is to fire off the Winds of Abandon. So I cast the Winds of Abandon here, and something really interesting happens here. So at the beginning of the round, Quanos said, if you do something and it's a legal action, you can't really take that back. If you do something and it's an illegal action, you have to rewind the game state. And he mentioned that just to make sure everyone was on the same page. And I'm pretty much okay with that for the most part. Or for the full part, once you say you're doing something, you put a spell on the stack. This is competitive REL, top 4, pretty serious stuff. So if you cast something and you put it on the stack and everything, it should just be there. So yeah, we cast this. I overload this Winds of Abandon. So even though this completely wrecks Ring's board, they can't really afford to not let this resolve. Twang ends up cracking their Ranger Captain. And then in response to that, Quanos also cracks their Ranger Captain. And then they also tap their Mother of Runes, targeting the Winota. So Twang cracks their Ranger Captain of Eos. And then in response, Quanos also cracks their Ranger Captain, which we'll see here in just a second. And then, just for funsies, they tap their Mother of Runes, targeting their Winota. In response to that, Ring actually casts Deadly Rollick. And I'm going to stop this right here. So, Winds of Abandon does not target. When you overload it, it replaces target with each. So instead of saying exile target creature, it now says exile each creature your opponents control. They can get a basic land for each creature exiled this way. So Mother of Runes does not actually stop this interaction. Now, Ring wants myself and Twang, we notify Ring that the Mother of Runes doesn't actually matter and they don't need to be casting their Deadly Rollick here. And so they try to take the spell back. Koanos actually calls a judge just to, since the spell was put on the stack, to make sure that, because they want this Deadly Rollick to come out. It's one less piece of removal for when Winota is recast, essentially. So it gets kind of weird. But, Koanos did say at the beginning of the game, he reminded everybody. Now, very interestingly enough, this Deadly Rollick was cast before priority was passed to me. So, there maybe could have been an argument made that I had not been given priority yet, and that I may or may not have had an action to take. And because of that, I maybe could have convinced the judge. I don't know. It could have gone either way. I'm not actually sure, but I did not think fast enough on my feet in that situation. But yeah, the priority was not passed to me when the Mother of Runes was activated, and that could have actually, swayed the decision on whether or not the Deadly Rollick was forced to be played or not. The Winds of Abandon ends up resolving. We exile the creatures on the board, and Koanos has a ton of basics in their deck. I wasn't really expecting that. Normally, players only get like 1 or 2 basics at most. Koanos is probably just ready for back to basics, or that's just what they prefer. They maybe like playing a lot of basics, playing around Blood Moon and stuff like that. So a very interesting deck building choice on Koanos that ends up, paying off for them pretty well here. Sometimes people go like, you got to build a deck this specific way, or you got to run like X amount of basics or whatever. Run what you're comfortable with. I think this is a really interesting lesson about personal deck construction, what you're comfortable playing with. Obviously, this decision to run this many basics plays in Koanos' favor. So yeah, a really interesting takeaway here from this specific match. As you can see here, Ring and Twang have 0 basics in their deck. Well, actually, Twang sacked the Ranger Captain because they knew they have no basics. So Ring's turn wasn't that eventful. It was Carpet of Flowers, paying for the Rhystic. At this point, since there's no Ranger Captain, it's probably wise to actually pay for the Rhystic now. It was a huge risk for me to actually wipe the board of Koanos because now there's no Ranger Captain to stop Twang from stopping the Twang from trying to win. But unfortunately, it was either like 100% lose to Koanos or like take my chances and hope that Twang can't win here. While we were kind of talking and going over board states and stuff, Twang was constantly saying that their hand wasn't that good, whether or not they were trying to, gaslight us and making us think that his hand wasn't very good. That's a different thing to be said, or to be had rather. So we get a land coming out from Twang, and we're actually going to see an intuition being fired off here. Because they actually do have a win attempt in their hand. So we're going to see an intuition coming out. Ring shows a force of will targeting the intuition. Unfortunately, it cannot pay for the Rhystic Study trigger, and then Twang shows a Flusterstorm targeting the force of will. So unfortunately, that's going to counter that. Intuition, still targeting Ring. So the Intuition finds Savine's Wreck, Underworld Breach and a Lion's Eye Diamond. We end up giving them the Savine's Wreck because they only had 2 mana available, so they wouldn't have been able to cast the Savine's Wreck. Twang has the Final Fortune to attempt to take the next turn. And at this point, I actually should have cracked my Flooded Strand here to find a land, and we'll see why in a second here. It's actually going to cost me a treasure. So if we're like thinking about making our plays as optimal as possible, cracking my Flooded Strand would have been optimal here, in my opinion. So yeah, we get the extra turn off of the Final Fortune. We're going to draw a card, and then Twang is actually going to cast the Savine's Wreck, targeting their Underworld Breach. And at this point, I am the only player left that can really respond here. Quanos is tapped out, plus they're in red-white, so not a ton of ways to interact. So here I crack the Flooded Strand, and Twang says they would like to respond to me cracking this Flooded Strand. And so they cast a Cyclonic Rift, targeting my survival before I get the extra mana. So here I'm forced to actually crack my treasure. To activate the survival, I discard a Treasonous Ogre and I find Endurance. And from there, I have it, the Court of Calling that I talked about at the beginning of the game, where I exile Court of Calling to evoke the Endurance and hit Twang's graveyard in response. Another interesting thing here is if I had cracked my land earlier, I also potentially would have had an extra mana to pay for the Rhystic Study, because they could have like top decked the Force of Will or something like that. Unfortunately, this strips my hand of everything. At this point, I'm pretty sure I only have a land left in my hand. Now I don't have my Treasonous Ogre. I've blown my Dockside, which means that, I've kind of lost a lot of the explosive power that my opening hand was kind of giving me there. I also lost the Court of Calling, very powerful tutor spell. So yeah, we shuffled Twang's graveyard back into the library, and unfortunately, or not unfortunately, but the Savine's Wreck fizzles, and with that, Twang does not have any other way to try to win the game with only 2 mana. Maybe something crazy like some rituals, maybe some more fast mana if they happen to draw into it, cast Thassa's into Tainted Pact. So knowing that I don't really have a follow-up play, I just find a tapped Temple Garden. So now we move on to Quanos' turn, and they have all of this mana and a bunch of things to cast with it. So they cast an Esper Sentinel, followed by an Imperial Recruiter. So the Winota player actually could have won here with this Imperial Recruiter. They could have used 2 white and the 1 red from the mountain to cast Imperial Recruiter. From there, they would have had 3 mana, and they could have found, or 3 red mana rather, and they could have found a Kiki-Jiki. They could have cast that Kiki-Jiki, and then tapped Kiki-Jiki, targeting the Imperial Recruiter. And the Imperial Recruiter would find a Village Bellringer, and from there they had plenty of mana. They could have cast their Village Bellringer and just won the game. Quanos was thinking more in terms of, getting out the, the value play here by finding the Goblin Mentor and casting their doggy, as well as playing out their Winota. So, this is another really interesting thing. I want to stop this right here. So, Quanos, again, like we did previously, very hastily just swung something at me. And, if we're going to do this no takebacks kind of thing and call judges, I should have called a judge here and attempted to force Quanos to swing into me here. So none of us say anything about this. So the Goblin actually ends up swinging at Wraith. The Winota trigger, fortunately for us, whiffs, but that actually would have been huge because if we had forced that Goblin to swing at us or swing at me and I killed it, there was like 0 humans were found on that trigger, and in addition to that, there were 0. They would have only had 3 Winota triggers next turn instead of a total of 4 potentially. So at this point, I don't have too much in my hand. I've got the survival, I've got a land, and I think right here I draw an altar of Dementia. So I swing my Ragavan at ring, try and find something. I hit a Soul Ring, which is actually super huge here. So I make a treasure. And I'm definitely going to be casting the Soul Ring this turn. I kind of flub up my mana here a little bit. You'll see that when I play my land out. So I cast the Soul Ring. I pay for the Esper Sentinel so they don't get the extra draw. And then from there, so I have a Taiga underneath those two lands there. So I'm going to take 2, and I'm going to cast a Survival of the Fittest off of a Sacred Foundry, which is a little awkward. But again, I do have the Taiga there, so it wouldn't have mattered in the long run because I did have a green to cast it, and I did not have a creature in my hand, to actually activate the Survival. So I get the Survival out this turn. And at this point, Ring doesn't have too much going on here either. The Carpet of Flowers is generating 0 value, unfortunately for them. So my hope is that, Quanos on their next swing does not find any type of stacks pieces. Ring casts a Drake, which is absolutely huge, and just assumes that it's going to resolve. Quanos says, wait, hold on a second. Trigger on the stack, gonna cast Deflecting Swat, and he swats the Gilded Drake trigger, targeting my Dockside, which is actually pretty huge here. So now the Winota player has more time to actually rev up and get more triggers off. So a really great hand from them. We move on to Quanos' turn. 1 card in hand. We're going to untap the Vault here, which makes sense. There's no point in taking more damage with all the mana that you have available to you. And I think there's that Hope of Girapur. Yep. We're going to cast that Hope of Girapur that we found a while ago off of the Thalia's Lancers, I believe. Move to combat. We got 2 goblins now. So now we have 4 Winota triggers, which is pretty huge here. They're all going to be going at Ring, because both of us have blockers at this point. Doesn't really matter. So our first 2 triggers are going to find Rionia, and the second one is going to find a Zealous Conscripts. Zealous Conscripts is going to steal my Gilded Drake, so now there's no blocker for any of the creatures that are swinging at me. VBR is going to enter the battlefield, which confirms, the suspicions that they could have gone for Kiki lines here. That's also going to be coming at me. And then we're going to get I can't remember what this creature is called, but when it enters the battlefield, you make a 1/1 soldier for each non-token creature you control, and these soldiers are not humans, so this pretty much guarantees that next turn Quanos is going to just kill us, because they're going to see pretty much their entire library with the amount of Winota triggers they're getting. So, yeah, we move to blocks. I take, I believe it's just like 10 damage. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, I take 10 damage. They move to their end step, and here I'm thinking I just need to draw any creature in my deck. I do draw a creature. I end up drawing a Simian Spirit Guide. So I want to take a second to pause. In my head, while these turns were going, I was thinking, what do I do if I draw a creature? How do I just win if I draw this creature? And I'm going through my head, as long as you don't draw any stacks pieces and I draw a creature, I can pretty much just win the game here. So I draw into the creature, and my line of thought was, I have the Altar of Dementia in my hand already. And with a Burgie, that guarantees that I win the game, because I can cast Burgie, I can cast the Altar, and then from there I can mill everybody out. And Quanos probably doesn't have a way to put a card back on top of their library in red-white. And the Ring, if they have like a Noxious Revival or something, I can just mill them out and then recast Dargo one last time, and then before if they like happen to have the Noxious Revival and put a card from their graveyard on top of their library, I can just sack Dargo and mill them again before they move to their draw step. So this was a guaranteed win line that I had set up. The other option I could have gone with was Academy Rector. If I go for Rector, I had a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 mana total. So I would have used 1 to find my Rector. I would have used 4 more to cast Rector. That would have left me with 2 red mana available, and from there I could have cast Dargo. And I would have found, obviously I would have gone for the Greater Good, and from there I would have seen the top 14 cards in my library. There is a decent chance that I find something there in the top 4, but in my mind I wanted to go for a more guaranteed win as opposed to taking a chance with the top 14 cards in my library. As we're going to see here in just a second, Quanos actually has a removal spell for Bergie, which is really unfortunate for me, and sometimes you just got to make him have it. Quanos had an extremely great hand, so congratulations there. Sometimes you just have it, looking back, the Rector line has less room for interaction potentially, since the line I go for actually dies to creature removal and non-creature removal. The Greater Good line, since once you cast Rector, you gain priority again, and there's no room to respond as long as the next thing I do is cast Dargo, which is the only thing I really had left in my hand to do. So I cast Dargo and I sacrifice Rector, and then the only thing I'm really susceptible to at that point is non-creature removal, if they can remove the Greater Good before Dargo resolves rather. And from there, as long as I can start drawing a bunch of cards, and potentially find some fast mana, whether I get like Bergie out or a Relic of Legends or something like that to just guarantee my win from that point. Even if he did have like a removal spell, there was less room for interaction to actually stop me from doing that specific line. So that was my thought process about finding Bergie as opposed to going for the Rector line here. So I sacrifice, or not sacrifice, I discard the Elvish Spirit Guide. I find Bergie. From there, I am going to put Bergie on the stack by sacrificing a treasure, which actually does put my sacrifice count up to 1. Making Dargo cost 2 less. From there, I'm going to cast the Bergie, and then I'm going to cast the Altar of Dementia, which does put a trigger on the stack for Bergie, so now I have 1 red floating with 1 sacrifice trigger, and now I can sacrifice Soul Ring and the Ragavan to make Dargo cost 1 red, and from there, I can just win the game. Unfortunately, with that add red trigger on the stack, Quanos does have the Path to Exile, targeting my Bergie, and from there I have 0 cards in hand and really nothing else to do, so I have to pass the turn, unfortunately. Ring moves to their turn. They do find that last land, and they cast a Timna, and then they pass the turn because they don't really have any other plays to do, unfortunately. Which actually makes me think that the Deadly Rollick being gone didn't really matter. So then Quanos just immediately moves to combat. We're not going to him and haw about anything. We're just going to move straight to combat. He swings at us and, looks through his entire library with all the Winota triggers and definitely gets enough damage to kill us. So, well played, Quanos. A really fun game, and just goes to show that, sometimes personal deck construction can really do a lot. The fact that he had all those basics in his deck was kind of insane. Really wasn't expecting that. So well played there, and definitely learned some really great lessons playing this game. So that's going to be all for this episode of Opalwave MTG, and that breakdown of the top 4 pod for the competitive EDH Discord tournament. I had a ton of fun in the tournament. The games were just really great games overall. Throughout the entire tournament, especially that last pod. Playing against like some of the best decks in the format is always really fun, and being able to kind of give other decks a run for their money with some less conventional decks. And I'm a really big fan of Naya. If you see me in a tournament, I'm probably going to be playing a Naya deck, so just be ready for that. Hey, thanks for watching, and until next time.